I'm going to welcome to HR Hot Topics number 7. What about the whatabouts? And appreciate everybody joining. I know it takes just a minute or so to everybody get logged in here. Let's do a quick sound check. Bob, how do you sound?
Well, I can hear you just fine, Charlie. I hope you can hear me.
Without an echo. That's great. How about you, Leslie?
Great.
I'm great. Good to see you guys.
Hey, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for
thank
having
everybody
us,
here
Charlie.
for joining us. Oh, sure. Hey, want to let everybody know that we appreciate you coming today. We've got, looks like they're all coming in right now. Perfect.
Good morning, Polly.
Hi, Polly.
You know, we've got a lot of questions that come in, and the three of us are regularly fielding them, and frankly, they're a lot of fun, but we kind of have questions that come in a lot that say, hey, what about this, and what about that, and what about, you know, and we always kind of joke about how, you know, it's like, what about the whatabouts? And so that's what we're doing today. We're going to be talking about.
Is that how it's showing up?
Oh, you okay,
Sorry.
Bob?
Sorry, Charlie. Heather just mentioned that the PowerPoint program there, you just changed screens. Okay.
Oh,
it had the entire text. Nope. There we go.
I know what she wants.
Sorry to interrupt you,
She's just
Charlie.
fine. So we've got the whatabouts. Watch this, Heather. Ready?
Beautiful.
Is that more beautiful right there?
Oh, spectacular, Charlie.
All right. I knew what I was doing. I've been catching on to these Zoom webinars. You can find all the webinars back at churchwest.com. You'll see the PDFs, some supporting links. Yesterday, we went through one on the Paycheck Protection Program forgiveness. Remember, it's a loan until it's forgiven. And so there's some pretty specific steps that your ministry has to go through in order to convert it into a loan. And then, can you guys hear the bells in the background?
I cannot.
Okay.
Neither can I.
Okay, just making sure. We've got churches on all the other corners, and so there's always the bells on every hour, which I like, but it tells us when to start and when to stop these webinars too. So sorry about the distraction. If you go to churchwest.com, you'll be able to find the previous webinars, supporting documents. You'll also find sign up for other webinars, like one tomorrow that we're doing at 11 o'clock is on reopening church. There's been a lot that's come out about reopening church, and a lot of that information that came out was prior to Governor Newsom putting out guidelines. And so what we've done is we put something specific for California churches that follows Governor Newsom's guidelines, kind of using best practices. And so anyway, I hope you can join us for that one. You can sign up for it on the website. So, but without further ado, we are going to start HR Hot Topics number 7. What about the whatabouts? And here we go. Bob, Leslie, how many whatabouts do you guys get a week?
Oh, gosh.
Wow, that's a hard question to answer.
That is a hard question.
It's interesting, though, Charlie. It seems like the questions, sometimes they seem like they're in the same general area, but it's a new twist every time. The questions keep coming up. They're the same, similar topics, and there are a lot of similar threads through them, but there's a different twist and a different sort of fact pattern either time. So I think that's why it's important that we go over these and continue to talk about them. So I hope it's helpful.
I think so. And we've just had more and more unique things that have been coming up right now. And it's changing again because a lot of people are getting ready to come back to work, and counties are lifting orders and things like that. So we've had a lot. So, hey, Leslie, why don't you take us through the first what about?
Okay, a quick question for you, Charlie. Somebody's asking about Hot Topics 4 and 5. I know one of them we didn't get recorded, but I was wondering if they're up on the website or if you could check by the end and let us know. All right?
Sure. Okay, I'll double check.
Awesome.
And I know, yeah, there were a couple that we tried to record on the cloud, and we ran out of space, and you know, I'm learning. Okay. This one, I guarantee it's going to be working, maybe.
Awesome. All right, let's dig into this one, Charlie.
Awesome.
HR manager Sally set up at community churches return to work program to comply with the county's COVID health orders. Okay, the program includes a building reentry plan for employees, temperature testing, completion of county health questionnaire, storage of completed questionnaires, building an exit plan for employees who have temperatures below 100. Isn't that above 100? Building
Should be above 100.
Yeah. Okay. Building an exit plan for employees who have temperatures above 100 degrees, and employees who test above 100 degrees will be sent back home. Basically, those two go together. How do we get them back out of the building? And then employees who test above 100 may be returned to be retested when they believe their temperature is below 100. Okay, so Bob, let's talk about building an entry plan. I know you recently started doing this for your office. So let's chat about it.
It's interesting. Charlie mentioned it, and I think you mentioned it as well, Leslie, that these rules keep changing. I have the San Diego County order, which is, of course, where our primary office is located. And we were preparing for this seminar yesterday, June the 3rd, and San Diego County issued a new order the day before, June the 2nd. So I'm rapidly trying to go through these things. But as far as the building entry plan, it seems to be important that you want to make sure that you have all of your employees coming in a specific location so that you're able to temperature test them. One of the things that I know we're going to implement here in my office when we reopen is sort of a staggered entry time plan for employees. It's something that HR managers may want to consider because we have roughly, probably 20 or so more employees that would come in at about the same time, usually about 8 o'clock in the morning. So if all of those people show up at the same time, then we're going to have a problem of trying to get them temperature tested to comply with San Diego County's health order to try to get them temperature tested as quickly as possible. So we are contemplating staggering the time at which people start their work. There's a question here. Is it required to take employees' temperatures upon arrival at work? I read from the ADA that we are allowed to, but not required. As far as a requirement to take them, San Diego County effectively requires them to be taken. So you're going to need to check with the county in which you are in. Yes, the ADA guidelines say that you are allowed to do it even if not required. I think it's good practice, at least at the beginning of the return to work program. But under the ADA doesn't say specifically that you have to do it. So one of the considerations that you may have is staggering the start time of employees so that you're able to implement this. The biggest consideration in everything that I am reading from the EEOC, from the ADA, from the county, all of these different locations is consideration of individuals' privacy. So as an example, in my office, we're going to have the employees enter a specific door. They're going to come into a conference room that we'll have available. They'll be able to get their temperature tested by themselves and then go out one of two exits. One entrance will go right into the rest of the office. The other door actually goes back outside. So if the individual tests above 100, the individual will be able to leave without having to be in contact with the remaining employees. So consider these things when you're doing the temperature testing. We're in a little bit of an optimal situation here in my office because of the configuration of the building. But as best you can, try to make sure that you consider the privacy aspects as well. That's very, very important. And that you do get everyone tested before they come to work. And I think it's important to make sure that if somebody does test above 100, that they be allowed to leave without going, past all of the other employees. Leslie, what are your thoughts?
I agree with you, Bob. So I have some churches, preschool, schools that are actually having someone take the temperature. You mentioned that they could take their temperature themselves. What do you think about that?
I don't think it's a good idea. As a matter of fact, Heather just told me a question popped up. Who does the testing?
Yeah.
You know, we have all these great guidelines from the county, in our case, the County of San Diego, but they don't tell you who should be doing this. So we are going to designate one individual in the office. I view it as an HR function. You may want to have somebody from your HR department do it, but we are going to designate someone from our office who will do it on a daily basis. I don't think it's a good idea to have individuals self-test because of the lack of objectivity there.
There
Also, to let you guys know.
Okay. There are temperature checks, I know, that they're like infrared, and you can stand like 4 to 6 feet away and take the temperature. So I think that obviously using PPE for that person that's taking the temperature, and maybe even finding a device like that. I saw them at Harbor Freight, Lowe's, Amazon. So.
And that's what I was going to say. The guidelines in California for allowing people to come into church is saying that they should be wearing a face covering, and they should be wearing gloves when they're doing that testing. And the face covering, you know, the mask. And it did also say, if you've got a handful of people, I think it's reasonable to do the mask and the gloves. But if you have quite a few people that would be there, if you've got a large staff, it's going to be more of a challenge. But you may want to look at those face shields and things like that. I mean, that's some of the recommendations that they're doing. But I think a big question that comes up, you guys, is about the privacy aspect of it. And Bob, you mentioned that it should be done in a private manner, but really the culture of church is a little more laid back than that.
Well, we're going to get to that, Charlie.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, the privacy thing, I think it is extremely important. We don't want to put anybody in a position where they're embarrassed in any way as a result of having, their temperature taken. With respect to the second issue on the PowerPoint there, it says completion of a county required health questionnaire. Actually, it appeared in some counties there is a health questionnaire that's required for employees who are returning. San Diego County, at least in our latest order, doesn't mention a questionnaire. I looked on the CDC guidelines this morning, and the updated CDC guidelines say that not only should you take somebody's temperature, but you should assess symptoms. So that would seem to imply from the CDC that perhaps at least asking someone about whether or not they have any symptoms, whether that's orally or whether that's done by a written questionnaire, seems to be very fluid from one location to the next. However, getting back to what you mentioned, Charlie, if in your location you are required or you opt to, as a matter of good practice, to use a written health questionnaire, make sure that you store those in a private place. Consider that a medical record, and make sure that those are immediately after they're filled out by the employee put in some sort of a secured file so that they're not available for other people to see them. Question here.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think that I have a sample health screening. So if you want a sample one, I'm not saying it's the perfect one, but it might help you guys as you look at the CDC guidelines and then add some things. So feel free to give me a shout out on an email and I'll send that to you.
Here's a question. I don't know if you saw it pop up, but I think it's a great question from Anonymous. But anyway, who takes the temperature, or the first person who comes in?
I know, it's like there's maybe the last person, but then everybody's already, if that person has a temperature, we're in trouble.
Yeah, we in our office, we have one individual that we are intending to be our temperature taking person, and we have another employee that we expect is going to come in at the same time. So we're going to suggest that they take one another's temperature before we begin the process of everyone else coming into the office. But the question is a really good one because it demonstrates how fluid this situation is and how many unknowns there are as we get into this process. So to a certain extent, we're trying to take the basic principles here and extrapolate from those as to what might be the best practice.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, now
Yeah.
we have.
And we
ahead,
were
Carolyn.
laughing because it's madness. We weren't laughing at the person that was asking the question. So it's just so many things come up. What about sometimes they record the temperature, and so there was like a self-testing. Somebody said our device records the temp, so self-testing would work as long as someone periodically checks the log, right? I don't know that that's the case.
I don't know if that's the case too, but then you have a whole situation, right, Bob, with what are you doing with that information? How are you storing it? Where are you, right?
Confidential file, treat it like a medical record and guard it as such. Okay.
Yeah.
You want to go to the next
Awesome.
example, Leslie?
Well,
You bet.
so
Here we
wait,
go.
did we get through all of that? Completion of the county health requirements, storage of completed questionnaires, an exit plan for employees that test above 100. So what, I just want to make sure, did we cover that? I didn't hear that.
Yes, I was suggesting that we're fortunate in my office in that the configuration of the building would allow the person to leave the area that they're being tested in without contacting the other incoming employees. If that is something that is possible at your location, I would highly recommend it. You also want to be able to have that person be able to leave without being embarrassed by the fact that their temperature was over 100 degrees. Again, there aren't any guidelines at least from the County of San Diego, and there aren't any guidelines from other organizations that I have seen, except this constant reminder to respect the privacy of individuals. So that's why I'm trying to work on the traffic pattern here.
Gotcha.
The question has also come up too, Leslie, if somebody's temperature is over 100, should they be required to get a physician's note before they come back to work? It's interesting because in some cases, at least until recently, a lot of their doctor's offices haven't been open.
Right.
Many of the primary care offices haven't been open. So their ability to actually get a note, a physical note, has been impaired. So we're going to have to be a little bit more flexible in that area. And we may be in a situation where we're going to have to rely on the representations of the employee that they did contact their healthcare provider and that the healthcare provider indicated that it was okay to return to work.
Well, I'm finding, Bob, that a lot of doctors' offices are doing telehealth appointments. And so you can still get them, and then you have to sign a waiver to have it emailed to you, like the results or the whatever, or the note.
Right.
So I would hesitate to let somebody come back to work without a clearance. I mean, I know you have to be a little bit flexible, and I guess I'd handle that case by case.
Yeah, I just saw on, I believe it was the EEOC guidelines, there was a question as to whether or not you could mandate a written note from the doctor. And under these circumstances, the EEOC apparently is allowing a fair amount of flexibility there because people simply aren't able to get that.
Right. Okay. Awesome. All right, Charlie, move along.
Okay, I was on mute. The anti-testers. All right. You should.
All right. You want to do this one, Bob, or you want me to?
Sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Sally has learned that an employee refuses to allow community church to take her temperature prior to working, and she also refuses to fill out the COVID-19 health screening questionnaire. This is funny because I actually called Bob with this one this week. So, Bob, I'll let you answer since you already answered it for me.
The way I look at this, and we have no legal precedent for this at this point, except some basic principles. What can this employer do that would uphold the policy or procedure that they have put in place here and at the same time avoid litigation? Does Sally face the possibility that this employee that doesn't want to have her temperature taken or fill out the questionnaire form, is this employee going to end up suing community church? And the answer at this point appears to be no, for multiple reasons. First of all, at least in some counties, the temperature test is required by the health department. number one. So it has to be done. If the employee refuses to have the temperature test done, then the options are simple. You either send the employee home until the order is changed, or the employee changes his or her mind, or you tell the employee that unfortunately you don't have a position available for them now. You might liken it to an employee who refuses to provide you their social security number, and you can't fill out your payroll obligations. So what can the employer do? Legally, the employer can tell this employee you're not eligible for employment at this point. What happened in your case, Leslie?
Well, in my case, they were able to allow telecommuting for a couple more weeks, and then they were going to require the person to return to work and do this. So we're not quite at that point yet. So you'll probably get another call from me next week or the week after.
Sure. In many cases with returning employees, it's not a question of the employer not wanting to have the person back or the employee not wanting to come back. But if they have this particular issue that can't be accommodated, and for whatever personal reason they don't want their temperature taken, the employer, first and foremost, is going to have to comply with the county health order. So that's really not an option.
All right.
I think that leads us into the next scenario here with Harriet.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll read
Leslie?
it. Harriet
Go
has
ahead.
worked as Community Church's account payable clerk since they poured the foundation 40 years ago. Harriet has been asked to return to work in the church office next Monday. Harriet intends to refuse to take Sally's temperature test, complete the health questionnaire, or engage in any similar nonsense. Harriet has made it abundantly clear that if Sally tries to suspend or terminate her, Harriet will sue Community Church for 1, age discrimination, and 2, violation of federal and state privacy rights. Harriet is serious because she's had enough of all the policies the HR manager has implemented over the last few years, and settlement of such a claim would allow her to finally retire.
Wow.
Oh,
All right. So let's talk about the intent of this one. She really wants to retire.
Well, this
Awesome.
this is an example that actually came to us as a question in a circumstance that frankly is not all that uncommon with churches that have been around for a long, long time. Sometimes you have an employee who has been there forever. They get set in their ways and they like the way things were run many years ago. And then all of a sudden, along comes Sally, the HR manager, who is implementing all of these HR policies and procedures to comply with the law. And the individual who's been there for a long time doesn't particularly care for them. So the question then becomes, and we began to address this really with the last slide, is what exposure to liability does Community Church have if Harriet, in this case, refuses to take the temperature test, refuses to fill out the questionnaire, or engage in what she refers to as similar nonsense? Well, we've addressed the issue with regard to the temperature test. That may very well be required by the county in which Community Church is located. If it is not, we're still looking at CDC guidelines that indicate that temperature testing should be done, and CDC guidelines that indicate that you need to assess symptoms. That may be by questions orally, or that may be by questions in writing. So it would seem to me that looking at the CDC guidelines and looking at the questions that the EEOC and answers that the EEOC is publishing, that the standard acceptable standard of practice in the community at this time is to take temperatures, whether or not they are required by the county, and to do some inquiry as to somebody's health status when they are returning to work. So if that is the standard of care and that is acceptable, then clearly in this case, as we're looking at Community Church, if they are applying this to all of their employees, then Harriet's claim for age discrimination isn't going to fly, because these two policies are going to apply to everyone regardless of their age. And as far as a violation of her federal or state privacy rights, the federal government is already telling us through the CDC and the EEOC that these are acceptable practices. So to the extent that it's an invasion of her privacy, I view it as one that is certainly acceptable. What are your thoughts, Leslie?
I totally agree with you. I think that because they're testing everybody, they can literally show that it has nothing to do with age and it has nothing to do with privacy or those types of things, because we already know that the ADA and both the EEOC and the CDC and public health orders are all saying that that we can do these things right now. There's a question that popped up from Deb Romero, and it says, who's checking on the employers, OSHA or the CDC? And I was going to type it out, but I'll just tell you. I think that right now there is not a lot of checking because of COVID-19. There's just not a lot of ability to do that. However, both OSHA and CDC have requirements, as well as public health orders, and as well as there's some workers' comp stuff. But I do believe that we will see some of this after the fact, Bob, maybe in the form of lawsuits and or complaints. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think that individual employees are going to have a really, really tough time with a lawsuit that's complaining that they refuse to take the test that is intended to protect everybody. You know, from a logical standpoint, sometimes when we look at these issues and we're applying basic legal principles to them and we don't have a lot of precedent, you've got to ask yourself, if I put this case in front of a jury, what would a jury think if these policies that the employer has put in place are intended to protect the health and well-being of all of the employees, and Harriet's complaining about that?
There's another question, Bob. It says, if an employee is sent home for registering a high temperature, they don't qualify for paid sick leave, correct? I actually would go ahead and have them use their paid sick leave, because I would send them home and I would ask them to seek medical treatment. And I mean, they may or may not be able, like Bob said, to provide a note or those types of things. What do you think about that, Bob?
Yeah, it would seem to me that if, you know, I'm not a physician, but if your temperature is 100 or more, your body has some sort of medical condition, and the individual would appear to me to be other than completely well at that point. And it would seem to me that if the government, through all these different agencies, is telling us we need to send this person home, then it is also appropriate at the same time to consider that the person is sick and eligible for the same for the paid sick leave. There was a question right before that, Leslie, too, that from Deborah that I wanted to address. It says, even if she takes the test, can the church decrease hours? And I assume, Deborah, you're meaning, can we reduce the number of hours that she is working? And certainly, I think we addressed this in one of the earlier webinars, but I'm glad you brought it up. You are still free to set whatever schedule is appropriate for your workplace. And as a result of COVID-19 and the shutdowns and all of these kinds of things, the need for employees has dropped in many cases substantially. You know, at the beginning of this, I was surprised when I heard this was our 7th seminar on this. In the very beginning, we were talking about layoffs and furloughs and letting people go, reducing hours and all of that. That still is something that employers need to consider, because things are not up and running as they previously were. So yeah, even if she decides to take the test and come back to work, whether or not she's going to return to work on a full-time basis or less than that is certainly, they're two separate issues as I see it. But as we've discussed before, make sure that if you are going to reduce staff hours, you are doing so in a non-discriminatory fashion. You're doing it based on a business reason. So just because Harriet appears to be a much older employee, don't reduce the hours of all of your older employees and not, not younger people. Unless, of course, she's in an area that there's a legitimate business reason to do it.
Got it. Good stuff. All right.
Let's next slide. Let's go to Hilda.
I want to know who
Hilda.
picked the names.
Heather.
I love these names.
All right. All right. Hilda has worked at Community Church's payroll clerk since 1 year after they poured the foundation 40 years ago. Hilda and Harriet are best friends and bowl together on Tuesdays. Sorry. They bowl together on Tuesdays. Hilda has been very healthy, but unlike Harriet, is very worried about all the news stories about COVID-19. Sally has notified Hilda that Community Church is reopening and Hilda should report for work in the church office on Monday. Hilda is afraid to leave her house and doesn't want to go back to work. Harriet says that if Hilda gets fired, Hilda can join in Harriet's intended lawsuit. I'm wondering about these two going bowling and the work comp exposure if they've been working 40 years.
You know, Charlie, I am an absolutely terrible bowler, but I think it's fun. It's a great thing to do every now and then if it's a rainy winter day or something like that. But anyway, the problem here is not unique. We've had many questions over the past several weeks about what to do with the employee who is simply afraid to come back to work right now. There are a number of options, and I look at this from a legal standpoint. So some of the options have flexibility, but the bottom line is, what is an employer's obligation to keep this person on if they don't want to come back to work? From a practical standpoint, if they can continue to telecommute, that's a way to accommodate them. If there is a possibility that you can let this person take unpaid time off, that's another possibility that, again, is your choice, but not legally required. The bottom line, though, is if Hilda simply is afraid to come back to work, unless she has a medical reason not to return, then she's required to come back to work. And from a legal standpoint, if she doesn't do so, then she has effectively abandoned her position. What more likely is going to happen here, and I think we may have discussed this a little bit in the last webinar, Hilda's easiest route around this is for her to go to her physician and get some sort of a note that indicates that she is in a risk category that makes the return to work unreasonably dangerous for her. And then the question becomes whether or not she should go off on FMLA or something like that temporarily.
Right. Good.
I think what we're seeing most is a lot of people don't have childcare, and that's the reason why they're not coming back to work.
Charlie, you keep jumping
Charlie,
ahead.
you're getting.
Oh, I knew it. God,
He's just,
I
Leslie,
studied this beforehand.
he's just too excited.
Oh man, Charlie
Okay.
you must read our minds.
I know. It's like a news tease. It's like coming up after this break.
All right, let me read
we
this.
just lost Bob.
Whoops.
All right, let me read this one.
Oh.
Sally has an
there he is.
employee. Sally has an employee who has a spouse who falls into the vulnerable class for COVID-19. Once Community Church makes the decision to bring staff back to the office, does Community Church need to make special accommodations for staff who are not comfortable coming back to work because they have a vulnerable family member? Sally wonders how Community Church should respond if other employees need time off because of a vulnerable family member. Now, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong. It's very similar to the last scenario. The fact is that they don't have to make accommodations or any type of changes or modifications because somebody has a vulnerable family member at home. I think that they can, if they want, allow them to telework if they can, but if they need the person back at work, they can definitely do that, right?
Yes, and this goes along with, I just saw, I'm reading the computer screen to my right here. Kathy just sent a note saying, I imagine one could use a doctor's note for a high risk as a reason to ask to work at home indefinitely.
Oh, not indefinitely.
Yeah, that's I think something, Kathy, I think that's going to be something we're going to see more and more. The question then becomes as to whether or not we can reasonably accommodate this employee by allowing them to work at home on a long-term basis. So the reasonable accommodation issue falls under the ADA, and then we start looking at the normal guidelines as to whether or not we can or cannot accommodate this person's status.
Well, and
But the vulnerable family member, you know, this gets back, this is very similar to the prior request. The question is whether or not we need to hold a job open for someone who does not want to return to work, either because they simply are afraid to, or because they have some family issue that causes them to concern. And the answer really is the same. Under the law, we don't have that obligation. The problem, and we sort of addressed it in the last sentence here from community church's standpoint, is if we accommodate one employee by saying, okay, you know, you've got a vulnerable spouse, we understand you want to stay home, is that going to start a house of cards with regard to a whole bunch of other employees who want to do the same thing? So that's certainly a consideration that the community church, and in this case, Sally, is going to have to keep in mind in making this decision.
A good question came up from Elizabeth. She says, what if a high-risk employee wants to return to work? Can we ask them to continue to remote work? You can always ask somebody to remote work. Right, Bob? You see any issue with that?
Oh, sure. Again, and we don't, because this issue is new, I could foresee in the future where you have a individual who is high risk and wants to telecommute, and you're able to accommodate that person, and then you have somebody who is not high risk at all, but simply says, I like working at home better. You know, they are theoretically, if you have a whole bunch of people that simply say, I would prefer to work at home than work in the office, how are you going to deal with that issue? The question could become, theoretically, are you discriminating against one group over the other? If somebody is high risk, that sounds to me like they may have theoretically an ADA issue to consider, and that would certainly be a reason to accommodate that individual and not accommodate individuals who simply would prefer to work at home.
Got it. Awesome. All right, Charlie, the next one.
Oh, I jumped a little quick there. What about if someone has a fever? Here we go. All right, I'll read it. Alfred, the bowler. Alfred, a loyal, longtime employee at Community Church, returned to work in the church office in the middle of last week. He is tested below 100 degrees each day until last Monday. He sought medical attention immediately. Unfortunately, he has just learned that although he had minimal symptoms, he tested positive for COVID-19. Sally quickly sent a notice letter to all other employees because she learned about sending the letter at a recent webinar sponsored by Community Church's insurance broker, Church West Insurance Services. Sally always attends their webinars because they're such nice people.
You like that little? Do you like that little pitch there, Charlie?
Yeah. Thanks. We're pretty nice. We like it. Sally's BFF, Susan, is the HR manager for a sporting goods retailer. Susan told Sally that Community Church needs to report Alfred's illness to Cal OSHA. Sally doesn't think Cal OSHA has an interest in religious organizations.
Good question. So most churches, Bob, as far as I know, aren't familiar with the Cal OSHA reporting requirements because, quite frankly, they really don't ever have a need to report those things. But in this situation, the Cal OSHA Form 300 could apply. Is that correct? And Charlie, can you put that form up for everybody while he's talking about it?
Sure, you bet.
Sure, Leslie. I got to agree with you that in the nearly 30 years that I've been working with religious organizations, I can't remember a time until just recently that the issue of reporting to Cal OSHA has come up. So as I am speaking for the next minute or so, I'm going to be looking down only because if you could see the top of the table here, I've got 7 pages of legal notes or legal pad notes spread out in front of me, so I don't want to miss anything on this. The question first becomes, in that Sally is dealing with, is who is covered by Cal OSHA, which employers are covered by Cal OSHA. And the basic principle is that all employers are covered by Cal OSHA. There is a carve out in the OSHA principles for employees who are engaged in religious services. So employees who are actually involved in religious services such as clergy, choir members, organists, musicians, ushers, those kinds of people. There is a carve out for them when they are engaged in religious services that OSHA doesn't apply to their activities. However, just because an employee who is otherwise engaged in secular services happens to be employed by a nonprofit religious organization doesn't exempt those employees from coverage under OSHA. So, what are the OSHA obligations that religious employers previously probably haven't even thought of that they might be considering? Of course, you may have gotten packages from different HR organizations, or even Leslie, regarding your obligations to put up posters about OSHA and notices about OSHA. But the important things that have now developed with regard to COVID-19 are whether or not you are required to record these on the Form 300 that Charlie has just put up on the screen, and whether or not you are required to report a COVID-19 case to Cal OSHA. First of all, the reporting requirements, or the recording requirements, I should say, let's address that first. Employers who have 10 or fewer employees in a calendar year do not have recording requirements. So the form that's put up, the Form 300, wouldn't apply to many of the churches that we deal with because they have 10 or fewer employees. However, if you have 11 or more employees, then you have to maintain the log of work-related injuries or illnesses that's up on the screen, Form 300. What do you have to record on that log? Well, the log deals with a death. Anytime an employee is away from work because of an illness, a work-related illness or injury, for any particular number of days, a work-related illness or injury that causes that employee to be restricted in their activities or transferred to a different job site or different location, a work-related illness or injury that requires medical treatment beyond first aid, and a work-related injury that causes loss of consciousness. So that's our recording requirements under Form 300 that's on the screen there. As far as reporting to Cal OSHA, you need to report a work-related fatality if one occurs, and you need to report a work-related in-hospital visit that a employee has. There's a question that just came up. Let's see, 10 or fewer. The question is it 10 or fewer, meaning part-time or full-time employees? Frankly, I don't know the answer to that, but if you send me an email, Iona, I'll look into that and let you know. As far as I can tell, the requirements simply say 10 or more employees. Charlie, do you know whether it distinguishes between?
I've dealt with this quite a bit.
Okay.
I've dealt with this quite a bit because these deal more with work comp claims and liability claims. And it's 10, it's more than 10. That's full-time, part-time, seasonal, occasional, things like that. So if you've got 10 or more than 10, you should be having the Cal OSHA form. And there's a couple of things that come into play here. If there's a death, if there's certain injuries, and then people also have the right when they apply for a job to ask to see your Cal OSHA Form 300. And the reason being is that people want to know, how dangerous is this place that I'm applying to work at? And so you can,
Charlie.
Yes, ma'am.
You know a lot about this, and there's a bunch of questions coming up. So while you're talking about that, will you address also, is COVID work related? And what happens if you've never sent in a Form 300, even though you have them, and you start sending them in?
Okay.
First of all, I got to tell you, Polly at College Avenue Baptist Church is the reason that we're talking about this. Her question just came up, is COVID-19 work related? And you know, these webinars keep you up to date, up to the minute with all the latest and greatest. If you had asked that question, Polly, a month ago, the answer would have been no. But apparently, as of May the 26th, Cal OSHA and OSHA has changed their mind, and it might be work related. So we'll get to that in just a second. But
I've got it up on the screen right now, Bob.
Do you? Good.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
And it's presumptive, and what they're going to do if somebody has a COVID-19 diagnosis and they worked within the previous, I forget how many hours, 14 days. Yeah,
well, that,
within 14 days.
Yeah, that's for workers' comp.
Yeah, that's the workers' compensation.
That's the workers' comp order, and frankly, this is. We were talking just before we started. Leslie and I were. There are so many discrepancies between workers' comp and what OSHA is saying and different agencies are saying, but you are absolutely correct, Charlie. For purposes of workers' comp, it is deemed a rebuttable presumption that the COVID-19 diagnosis is work-related for purposes of giving that employee workers compensation coverage. For purposes of whether you have to record it on the Form 300 for OSHA or report it to OSHA if the individual had gotten COVID-19 and passed away or needed to be hospitalized, then the question isn't so clear, and OSHA has acknowledged that it isn't clear. But as of May the 26th, employers are now supposed to, according to OSHA, be taking action to determine, I'll read this just so I make sure I don't miss it, should be taking action to determine whether or not the employee's COVID-19 illnesses or are work-related and therefore recordable. So the test that we are given at this point from OSHA is that the employer, assuming you have an employee who has a confirmed diagnosis of COVID-19, the employer is to ask the employee if he or she believes that they contracted COVID-19 illness in the workplace. That's the first question that you are supposed to ask. The second question that you are supposed to ask, and you are supposed to be respectful of the employee's privacy, is you are supposed to ask the employee about the nature of the work that they are doing that causes them to believe that perhaps they got it in the workplace. And secondly, what out of work activities they may have been involved in that may have led to a positive COVID-19 diagnosis. And thirdly, the employer is supposed to review the environment in which the employee is working for any potential indication that there may have been a positive result from the workplace itself. So this is one of the very rare incidents. Hold on, this question just came up here. Let's see. I was told by a consultant in Cal OSHA that we did not need to record on Form 300, though we have more than 10 employees. We were posting it and she said we didn't need to. Sounds like she was wrong. Basically, as I am reading, Caroline, as I am reading the requirements from OSHA, that recommendation that you got is wrong. And it's 11 or more employees you should be filling out the Form 19. But as far as the rule as of May the 26th, if you have a confirmed diagnosis of an employee with COVID-19, then you need to ask that employee if they believe that they got it in the workplace. And then secondly, ask them what other activities they may have been involved in outside of work that could have resulted in the positive diagnosis. Now, from a practical standpoint, as we've been going along for the past couple of months now, many employees have been working from at home. So if the employee tells you that they've been diagnosed with COVID-19, and they haven't been in the workplace at all, then the first question that you ask them is, do you believe that you contracted the COVID-19 from work? The answer to that is undoubtedly going to be no, because they haven't been there to do it. And the second question, again, respecting their privacy, do you believe that you caught it outside? It would seem to me that the obvious answer to that would be yes. And once that is the case, then there wouldn't be a need to fill out the Form 300 or make a report to Cal OSHA. Have you had this come up, Leslie?
I was actually going to ask Charlie. Charlie, there's a couple questions. If you've never done a Form 300 and you start doing them, does that cause an issue? Or if you've never done one and you do one, what does that do? Does that open up a can of worms with Cal OSHA? Do you know? Have you had this experience?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not a big deal. I mean, if you look at it, it's really just recording all the things that you're doing, and you're required to post it. It really isn't a big deal. You can see the form. I've got it up on the screen right now. And it's not going to open up a can of worms or anything like that.
Awesome. Hey, so there's another question about how do you deal with an employee that tested positive during the probationary period? That employee would be
quick.
That would be no, Charlie. That employee is no different than any other employee. You can't fire them because they get COVID-19. You would have to deal with them just like everybody else. They would still have benefits available to them through the new emergency leaves and sick leave and those types of things. So if those leaves apply.
And let me clarify just something a little bit. The reason you're asking a lot of those questions is because there's a contact tracing protocol that they're trying to do in California. It's very important. It's not, they want to say, hey, where did you catch it? Because they want to backtrack and see other people that you may have exposed. As far as who's going to pay the claim, it's going to be your work comp insurance carrier. They're going to be on the hook for it if they've been working within the past couple of weeks. But you're asking more questions than you normally would in a typical injury or illness situation. And the reason why is because they want to try and stop the spread a little bit.
Yeah, I just thought it was important to bring up this issue today, simply because, as we mentioned in the beginning, in all the years that I've been working with churches, a contractor reporting to OSHA certainly has not been something that's been high on the list of issues that has come up by a long shot. And now all of a sudden, because of this change in the OSHA requirements as of May the 26th regarding whether or not COVID-19 is a potentially work-related illness, now all of a sudden it is an issue that churches are going to have to keep in mind as a possible issue that they're going to have to report on, or at least record on the Form 300.
Awesome. All right, let's go along to the next slide.
Polly just asked, are we expected to report to any other authority? Not that I am aware of, Polly.
Yeah, somebody asked the question, do they have to report to public health? And that answer, as of last time I checked, was no. That's up to physicians to report to public health. So you very well may have to report to Cal OSHA. All right, what about social distancing?
Okay, hit it.
Who's hitting it?
Go ahead,
Leslie.
Well, while reading the Los Angeles Times Tuesday morning, Sally saw an article about Memorial Day celebrations at Zuma Beach. The article emphasized that large crowds drawn to the beach and the crowd's disregard for precautionary measures such as social distancing and or face coverings. To Sally's shock, one of her photographs accompanying the article depicted Holly, Community Church's receptionist, in the middle of the large group of people standing very closely, none of whom were wearing face coverings. Boy, this church has a lot of problems. Sally feels that she must act. What were you going to say, Bob?
Have you noticed that if you work for Community Church, aside from Sally, if you are female and have been employed at Community Church, you need to have a name that begins with an H.
Sally feels that she must act to keep Community Church's employees and congregations safe. Should Sally fire Holly, suspend Holly, and insist that she self-isolate for 14 days? Use the article as a learning experience and send a group email to all of Community Church's employees in order to call out Holly on her irresponsible behavior, discourage similar behavior, or inform others so they can avoid close contact with Holly should they feel her actions pose a threat to their health. Now, Bob, I don't know. We don't know what our employees are doing outside of work, whether we see a picture or not, right?
We really don't. And I'll tell you, this is one of the areas where we have very little guidance with respect to how to deal with this issue in the COVID-19 circumstance. From a general perspective, what your employee does on their personal time is their business, to the extent that their behavior is not in some way embarrassing to your organization. Religious organizations are very sensitive to this, because if you have an employee who is out doing something that would be embarrassing to the religious organization, and it's known that that employee has a connection to the religious organization, then that may very well be grounds to take some discipline, even though the behavior is outside of work activities. But aside from that, generally speaking, what employees do on their own time is their own business. But here, all of a sudden, we have information that raises the concern that Holly's behavior could potentially threaten the health and safety of other employees. And frankly, we don't have a whole lot of guidance on this issue, except to follow what the current guidelines are, and that's continue to temperature test people as they're coming into work and ask if she has any symptoms or not. I wish I had a better answer for you than that, but this is one that I foresee as an issue coming up more and more as more businesses start to open and people come back to work.
Bob, on a lot of the questionnaires, in fact, even some of the questions the CDC says you can ask, you can ask the question, have you traveled outside of wherever over the past 14 days? And have you been around anybody who might have had it, or, all these types of questions. So what do you do if somebody writes on their questionnaire, and I didn't pre-warn you for this, so sorry. What do you do if somebody puts on their questionnaire, they've traveled outside the United States, and what do you do with that? And that's the only thing. They don't have a fever, they don't have anything, they've just traveled outside the United States.
The guidance that I've seen, I believe it was from EEOC and perhaps from the CDC, I can't recall, is the issue isn't necessarily that they have traveled outside of the United States, but whether or not they have traveled to a region that is a particular hotspot. And if they had, then you might be in a position of requiring that employee to self-quarantine before that they return to work. But again, applying that same principle to Holly here, if we ask her, do you have reason to believe that you were in contact with somebody that is positive for COVID-19? She's at Zuma Beach. Apparently there were a whole bunch of people there. As far as her answer is undoubtedly going to be, as far as I know, everybody was fine. Everybody seemed to be having a good time.
Right.
Hey,
so
Leslie, real life situation, or let me ask you, real life scenario, Leslie, would you grab Holly and say, hey, Holly, we saw this on social media, you've got to cover your mouth. Would you at least address it with her in this time with coronavirus?
I actually have a client who's going through some very similar stuff, and it's a church, right? It's a church. Mm-hmm. It's a religious organization. And I just said, why not have a conversation with somebody that just says like, hey, we're in this really difficult time right now, and it's hard to have discernment, and we can't tell you that you can't go to Zuma Beach. But the fact of the matter is when you post that on Facebook, that makes other people nervous. And, maybe you could not post those things, but there's no requirement. This is not an order. It's not a directive. Bob, are you okay with having that kind of conversation?
Sure. I think it's probably the responsible thing to do. And I would approach the conversation in a very diplomatic, caring way. and say we're concerned not only about your health and safety, but we're concerned about the health and safety of everybody that works with us. And that's the only reason I'm bringing this up with you. You don't approach it as a disciplinary discussion, but simply as a reminder that we want everybody to be safe and everybody to be healthy.
So you can't really go up to the person and say, you're a contagion spreader.
You could. I don't think it would turn out very well.
All right.
All right. Okay. Let's talk about the preschools as we're getting to lunchtime here.
All right.
All right. Ready? Community Church is planning to reopen its preschool. Community Church can't bring back all of its teachers because only half of the students will be returning. Can Sally use performance as a factor in deciding which teachers to bring back and who she chooses not to offer a position to?
Absolutely. I think you can use performance, but one of the questions I got this week, Bob, was, hey, we want to let this employee go. We need to cut our staff by 1 or 2. And we've decided to let these 2 people go because they have, under par or their poor performance. They happen to be the oldest members of the staff, and they happen to have the most longevity on staff. So what do you think about that, Bob?
You're running the risk that you're going to get an age discrimination claim. If those individuals legitimately are the poorest performers and you're able to objectively document that, then that is the important factor. People can make all kinds of claims. They're going to claim it's age discrimination. They're going to claim it's some other sort of discrimination or retaliation or whatever it is. That is why the objective standards are so important. And I think what's going to happen when community church or similar employers look at this kind of a scenario, it should cause the human resources department to look at performance reviews and realize how important these things are. And if they have been in a position in the past where grade inflation, as I refer to it, has run rapid, where everybody is assumed to have done a good job, and some people have done fantastic jobs, and we never want to say anything negative about anybody, you start to see when you're in a situation like we're in now, what a problem that could be. So perhaps we can use it as a learning experience going forward to be much, much more objective and realistic when we use performance reviews, because you may end up in a situation in the future where you're required to choose between the good performers and the bad performers for whatever reason it might be. And having objective standards to do that is very important.
Great question to tag on to that, Bob, is Deb asked the question. She had to do this. She had to let them go. The question is, do they have to rehire them when they start rehiring individuals or when they start filling their staff again? That's a great question. If you lay off a bunch of people due to COVID-19 because of unforeseen economic business realities, do you have to hire all those same people back?
No. And Deb, what you would be looking at, and it's really the same issue, what you're really looking at, as I see it, is this person that you let go previously and that you don't want to rehire is now an applicant. And the question is going to be, would that applicant, just like any other applicant, have a potential claim against you as the employer, and that you discriminated against the applicant based on race or some race, age, some other protected class, gender, whatever it might be? Did you discriminate against that applicant based on a protected status? Or, as you're talking about here, or we're talking about here, are you electing not to rehire that person because they were a poor performer previously? And hopefully, Deb, with regard to the person you don't want to rehire, you have documentation regarding their prior performance. So if they do bring an age discrimination in the hiring process claim against you, you can demonstrate that your objective reason for not hiring this person is because, you know, they were a poor performer previously. Oops, I lost the sound for Leslie there.
Leslie's muted. That's okay.
Oops.
We can. Oh, she just muted it again.
I'm not touching it. It's
There
like,
you go.
it's like possessed muted. Anyway, Bob, I had a question for you. So my client had 2 employees who had poor performance, and she wanted to let them go. And they were the oldest, and they'd been there the longest. And the problem is that the last performance evaluation was a year or longer ago, and there had been no other write-ups, no performance addressed. And so there really wasn't a lot to show that their performance hadn't improved, because they had gotten a poor performance evaluation and nothing since then, right? So
Yeah.
so in that case, I would be a little more hesitant to say, oh yeah, go ahead and just lay those 2 off, right?
Well, your question goes right along with the question that just popped up on the screen.
Right.
Let's say we have no performance reviews to fall back on. Do you have to hire in the order of seniority? The answer to the question about whether you have to hire them in the order of seniority is no. Unless you're under a collective bargaining agreement that would require you to hire people based on their seniority, you don't have to. The benefit of having prior performance reviews is that it demonstrates your objectiveness in evaluating different candidates for jobs as you are bringing them back. If you don't have written performance reviews, you certainly, I would assume, have had experience with these people. You, as the HR manager, have observed their performance in the past. Perhaps you've talked to their supervisors before, and their supervisors can tell you this person does this better than this person, and so on and so forth. It is more difficult if you don't have written performance reviews, but it's not insurmountable. It certainly would be preferable if you had it. But again, the criteria here is that, or the most important factor here is that you are not refusing to hire somebody based on the fact that they fall into a protected class. That's where the discrimination would be inappropriate.
All right, we're running a little short on time, so let's get through the next 2 slides. And
All right, I'll read them both.
Okay.
Sally is planning ahead. Now that the school year is coming to an end, employees at Community Church will no longer be able to claim that their child's school is closed due to COVID-19. The school will be closed during the summer months regularly anyway, and working parents have always had to find childcare over the summer. Are employers obligated to continue accommodating staff to work from home so that they can also babysit their children? Leslie, what do you think?
Well, this is a very interesting one. So I guess it would depend, Bob, on what their circumstances were previously. If in the summer my school was closed and I had childcare through my family, and I came to work every summer after school was out, then I would probably be expected to come to work in the summer, right, Bob?
I would certainly think so, yes. The only protection in the law that's unique or new here is if this person cannot come to work because their child care has been precluded by the COVID-19 pandemic, in which case they would fall under the emergency FMLA. But if they simply don't have child care, not because the place that they had always had them in the summer is closed because of the pandemic, but rather because they would prefer to stay home and babysit themselves, that's not an activity that would protect their job.
So there's a couple of questions around this, and I know we got to hurry, but let's see if we can get one in. I have an employee who had her family watching her kids, but now she says her parents are vulnerable. Then I would say the leave would be available to her. And then another question is, what if a preschool child care employee has been out on FFCRA leave due to the child school being closed through mid-June, and the employee says they can't return over the summer because they don't have childcare, which is usually provided by the mother during school holidays. How do you document a COVID-19 reason for lack of childcare? Well, I mean, that daycare provider is not available, right, Bob?
Well, Carolyn, I think your question is right on point, and it's not an easy one to answer. It's somewhat evidentiary based, because you may remember when we first started talking about whether or not somebody was eligible for emergency FMLA because their child care facility had been closed because of COVID-19. We had indicated that sometimes the person could come in, they could show you a copy of the website from the school that says we're closed because of COVID-19. So there's some affirmation that the reason the child care program is not available is because of COVID-19. As I understand the question that you've answered, it's simply that I think it went off the screen, but that the mother, whoever used to take care of the child, is now not available. That doesn't sound like a COVID-19 reason to me.
All right. Charlie, want to do the next slide?
Did we lose Charlie?
Yeah, okay, I'll read it. Hannah
Oh,
has,
sorry. Oh,
There he's back.
there he is. Charlie, go.
okay. I just was doing all the H's because Heather came up with the names, I think. We should have Heather use such a bad name on each one of these. Hannah has never really liked Hilda or Harriet, but she now has something in common with them. She doesn't want to return to work on Monday as instructed by Sally. Hannah is making more money on unemployment than she earns working, but the bigger problem is that Hannah won't have childcare for her 2-year-old daughter, Haley, for at least several more weeks. Hannah doesn't want to get fired, but doesn't want to go back to work. Would Hannah be eligible for EFMLA?
Yes, if her childcare is unavailable.
If it's not, we don't know the reason that it's not available, though. In order for her to be eligible for EFMLA, the child care services must not be available because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we really don't know in our example here the reason that childcare for Haley isn't going to be available for a couple of more weeks. If it's because of the COVID-19 circumstances, then clearly Hannah would be eligible for EFMLA. If it's just because, Haley's grandmother has gone on a trip to Florida or something like that, that's a reason that wouldn't be covered by EFMLA.
Okay. Here were two other quick questions that came up.
Carolyn, your question is right on point. I was thinking of it before, and we don't have an answer to it. The question is if the mother, let's see, whoops, it keeps popping down. Is if the mother is a vulnerable class, does that qualify as a COVID-19 reason? All I can tell you is what the EFMLA says is if the child care facility is unavailable because of COVID-19. Let me look at the exact language of it here. If the school or place of child care has been closed or the child care provider of such son or daughter is unavailable due to a public health emergency. I don't think that the grandmother or the mother simply falling into a vulnerable class makes that person unavailable due to a public health emergency. But again, like so many questions that we're dealing with here, we simply really don't know the answer to that just yet.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right, Charlie, will you answer the last one?
I am with Lisa.
Yeah, or we can.
I'm gonna send that privately. We're good.
Okay, awesome.
And then this is my favorite slide, everybody. Bob and Leslie. There's a way to do a poll here. If we can get people to comment and whether or not Bob should keep the goatee or not, because
I vote yes. I vote yes.
Oh my gosh. I've got to tell you, Charlie, as you may imagine, or perhaps you've never even thought of this before, but for the past couple of decades, I have not been a big consumer of hair care products. And now suddenly I have hair where I hadn't had it before. So I don't know, and I'm going to try to learn here whether or not there are hair care products or whatever for my new goatee here. But whether I keep it or not, I don't know at this point. What do you think?
You got to keep it. Deb and I say yes.
Yeah. Elise
right,
says
guys.
yes. Sabra.
Thank you.
Of course,
Thank you
Sabra
so
says
much.
yes. And
Holly, feel
we
free
got
to
them
give
all.
me a
Yes,
call
yes.
later this afternoon. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And Lisa calling us too. All right. Hey, guys, thank you all so much. Maybe we'll see you tomorrow on our webinar about reopening church. And to let you know, I did find out that a couple of the webinars were emailed out but weren't kept. And so that's maybe why we missed a couple. But we're doing all that we can and putting all of them up we can. Again, Leslie, Bob, thank you. Both fantastic, both awesome. Stay safe. And most importantly, Bob, keep that goatee. That looks so good. So good.
Thank
All right,
you,
guys.
Charlie.
Thank you all.
We
All
appreciate
right,
it.
bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for
All right,
joining us.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.